Picture this. You're walking through the marble corridors of a Mughal palace at the edge of collapse. The air is heavy with sandalwood and secrets. Somewhere behind gilded doors, a man once revered as the jewel of the world lies writhing in agony. His skin burns with fever, and his mouth is filled with the taste of metal. Attendants whisper, doctors wait helplessly, and a golden solution cools in a goblet, already swallowed. The emperor, once garlanded with silks and praise, now moans in the dark, not from war wounds or divine punishment, but from the poison of his own desperation. Before we descend into this labyrinth of fading power and unbearable decisions, consider subscribing if you're drawn to the quieter, darker corners of history, where pain hides behind splendor. And tell me where you're watching from. It's strange and beautiful, isn't it? That across centuries and continents, we can gather around a single question. Why would a man drink molten gold? This is not merely a story of opulence gone wrong. It's about an empire's slow death, a body turning against itself, and a man who tried to ingest immortality. His name was Muhammad Shah, though he is remembered by a darker moniker, Muhammad Shah Rangila, the colorful emperor. But the colors had begun to bleed. He ruled the Mughal Empire during its long twilight. Not at its zenith of power, when Akbar debated with philosophers under golden domes, nor at its muscular middle, when Aurangzeb's armies stretched from Kashmir to the southern tip of the subcontinent. Muhammad Shah's reign began in the year 1720 and would last almost 3 decades. But this longevity was not a sign of strength. It was the inertia of a corpse that no one dared to bury. According to historians, the empire under his rule was fragmented not just politically, but psychologically. Successive invasions by Persian and Afghan warlords, internal rebellions by Rajputs and Marathas, and the rot of administrative neglect all hollowed out the body politic. Yet inside the Red Fort, court life continued as if nothing had changed. Courtiers composed odes to the emperor's fragrance. Eunuchs competed for influence. Elephants paraded through lotus-filled courtyards. It was a dream state, the lull before collapse. Muhammad Shah, for his part, was no tyrant. If anything, he was too gentle, too indulgent, too enchanted by aesthetics. He loved music so much that he restored court patronage to musicians long ignored by his more austere predecessors. He brought back wine, poetry, courtesans, and peacocks. He even personally composed ghazals under a pseudonym. But history is not kind to emperors who choose beauty over discipline. His reign became a parable of fatal distraction. The first antagonist was already at work by the time Muhammad Shah took the throne: the chronic fragility of the Mughal court itself. Power here was not stable or absolute. It was delicate, like enamel on a mirror, cracking under any pressure. Every day, the emperor had to navigate a network of factions: Persian nobles, Indian generals, Shia advisors, Sunni clerics, former rebels turned loyalists. Each wanted a piece of the slowly crumbling pie, and the emperor, preferring music to war, often gave it to them. He did not see, or chose not to see, what others had already sensed. The Mughal world was shrinking. Bengal was slipping away. The Deccan was already lost in practice, if not on parchment. And then, in a gesture so grand it almost felt mythical, Nadir Shah of Persia invaded. That moment, February of the year 1739, is when everything changed. It was winter when Nadir Shah crossed the Indus. His army, forged in the fires of Central Asia, moved like a scythe through the wheat fields of Punjab. He was not just a conqueror, he was a mirror held up to the failing empire. Where Muhammad Shah lingered over poetry, Nadir Shah wrote his history with iron. The Mughals, bloated with ceremony and rusted by complacency, were unprepared. They sent envoys, hoping for negotiation. They sent soldiers, hoping for delay. But Nadir Shah wanted neither tribute nor diplomacy. He wanted to take the capital itself, to walk through the famed Chandni Chowk as if it were his own garden. And he did. In March of that same year, he arrived in Delhi. Historians differ on what the emperor was doing when news reached him. Some say he was at prayer. Others say he was listening to a courtesan sing an old love song. In either case, the reaction was the same: disbelief laced with dread. No Persian army had marched so deep into India since the time of Tamerlane. This was not a raid, it was an autopsy. By the time Nadir Shah entered the Red Fort, Delhi was already crumbling under the weight of its own fear. The city held its breath. The streets were silent. Doors were bolted, and whispers traveled faster than horses. The emperor, in silks and trembling dignity, met the invader in the Diwani Khas, the hall of private audience. There, under ceilings that once echoed with the ambitions of Akbar and Shah Jahan, Muhammad Shah handed over not just his empire, but his soul. What followed is still considered one of the most traumatic events in the subcontinent's urban memory. A single spark, a market skirmish between Persian soldiers and Delhi locals, set off a massacre. For 6 hours, the streets ran red. According to contemporary accounts, over 20,000 were killed. Some sources say more. No one knows for sure. What is certain is that the river Yamuna, which once reflected the gleam of palaces, flowed choked with bodies. The Peacock Throne was taken. So was the Koh-i-Noor diamond. Priceless manuscripts, textiles, armor, musical instruments, everything was looted. Delhi's treasures, once envied from Constantinople to Canton, were packed into wooden crates and strapped to the backs of horses. When Nadir Shah departed, he left behind silence and ash. And Muhammad Shah? He remained emperor in name. Nadir Shah had humiliated him, yes, but had not dethroned him. That, historians suggest, was part of the cruelty. To be left alive, still in charge, while knowing you were nothing. This was the second antagonist in his life. Not a man, but a feeling. Shame. From that moment on, the emperor was not the same. He retreated from court for days at a time. He stopped composing verses. His eyes, once described as full of mischief, now held only shadow. He began drinking more, often alone. Attendants noted that he avoided mirrors, as if afraid of what might be staring back. The court, sensing the shift, filled the silence with louder music, brighter silks, more aggressive games of courtly flattery. But no one believed it anymore. And still, the empire continued, on paper, in ritual, in the tired rhythms of ceremony. Governors still sent tributes. Coins still bore his name. But in the margins of official documents, you can almost see the ink begin to fade. It was around this time that a rumor began to circulate. Quietly at first, among the harem staff, then among palace physicians, that the emperor, afflicted by age and humiliation, had developed an obsession with the idea of preserving himself, not just spiritually, physically. He feared decay. He feared invisibility. He feared becoming forgotten. And that is when he began to drink gold. In the twilight of empires, superstition often replaces strategy. For Muhammad Shah, the years after Delhi's humiliation became a time of inward spiraling. He began consulting mystics instead of ministers. He sought omens in the patterns of incense smoke. And in hushed, candlelit rooms deep within the harem, he listened to alchemists. These were not the court astrologers of his youth, with their charts and careful deference. These were men from the edges of respectability: Persian exiles, Bengali ascetics, renegade yogis, claiming secret knowledge from hidden texts. One such figure, referred to only as Hakim J, would become the third antagonist in the emperor's life. Not a villain in the usual sense, but a man whose knowledge was equal parts truth and poison. It was Hakim J who rekindled the old idea that gold, if properly prepared, could extend life. The theory was not new. From China to Byzantium, rulers had long believed that ingesting purified gold could cleanse the blood, purify the organs, and slow decay. But such alchemical remedies had always danced on the edge of death. Gold is beautiful, but inside the human body, it is a razor. Still, the emperor was desperate. Court records mention the sudden increase in procurement of basma, ashes of precious metals, prepared through ritual incineration. Gold was hammered thin, calcined, and mixed with honey, rosewater, or clarified butter. Sometimes it was made into a fine powder, sometimes into lozenges, sometimes mixed into elixirs administered on an empty stomach. The doses were meant to be small, ceremonial, but Muhammad Shah began demanding more. Historians believe this is when the real damage began. He started losing weight. His gums darkened, his speech slurred, slowly, like someone walking through deep water. There are references to tremors in his hands, to ulcers, to periods of wild euphoria followed by days of crushing fatigue. But worst of all, according to one court physician's private letters, was the change in his mind. He began confusing names. He would speak to dead courtiers as if they stood before him. He forgot his own poetry. He once tried to recite a ghazal and could only recall the first line, repeating it over and over as tears ran down his face. When ministers approached him with petitions, he stared at them as if through glass. But no one stopped him. No one dared. That, perhaps, was the final cruelty. Power had made him untouchable, even in ruin. The same hierarchy that once served to magnify his glory now acted as a wall between him and rescue. Physicians lied to preserve their positions. Courtiers praised his appearance even as he decayed before them. Servants prepared the gold elixirs each morning, hands trembling, knowing what it was doing. This wasn't just an emperor poisoning himself, it was a system conspiring to let him. And beneath it all, beneath the fading silks, the thinning voice, the cold cups of liquid metal, was a man who remembered what it had been like to be admired, to feel alive under the eyes of a court, to be, even briefly, the sun around which the world turned. The pain began in the abdomen. That's what the records say, a persistent, gnawing burn, followed by vomiting, fever, disorientation. He insisted it was passing. He insisted on continuing his rituals. But by then, his attendants had begun to smell it. The strange metallic breath, the faint scent of decay beneath his robes. The end had begun. In the final weeks, the palace no longer smelled of rosewater. The stench of sickness crept through marble halls like smoke. Those who served Muhammad Shah tried to mask it, burning sandalwood, strewing jasmine petals near his chambers, but the air itself had turned. Even silence became sharp. He was no longer able to sit for audiences. The once vivid robes, turquoise, pelks threaded with gold, hung loose from his frame. His fingers trembled, and his eyes, once lined in kohl, seemed to sink into his skull. He no longer recognized the musicians he had once loved. and when his favorite instrument was brought to him, he stared at it blankly, unsure whether to listen or to pray. There are no direct descriptions of his deathbed. The Mughal chroniclers, bound by decorum, chose euphemism. They speak of a wasting illness, a rare imbalance of humors, a decline brought on by celestial misalignment. But private accounts, letters from foreign envoys, scribbled memoranda from junior court physicians, suggest something more harrowing. According to one such note, the emperor screamed in his final days, not continuously, but often enough that servants took turns guarding his door, rotating every hour. He could not keep food down. His stools turned black, his breath rattled, and worst of all, he began to hallucinate. He spoke of gold rising in his throat, like a serpent. He whispered of his own reflection melting in mirrors. He accused his attendants of poisoning him, then begged them for more of the same draught. This was no symbolic decline. This was organ failure, metal toxicity, delusion. This was death arriving not with honor, but with corrosion. Outside his chambers, the court still functioned, mechanically, absurdly. Elephants were still bathed. Diplomats were still received. Peacock fans still waved lazily over ministers rehearsing lines for a ruler who would not rise. The facade held because the alternative, acknowledging the emperor was dying, and not from age or battle, but from self-destruction, was too dangerous to name. The empire itself had already begun dying by then. Bengal was functionally autonomous. The Marathas raided northward with impunity. The British East India Company had established trading posts along the coast, quietly building fortresses. Muhammad Shah's courtiers debated policies as if they mattered, but their voices were faint echoes against a rising tide of collapse. The fourth antagonist was time. Time which corrodes even stone. Time which preserves nothing but the illusion of continuity. The same time that allowed the emperor to reign for nearly 3 decades without ever truly ruling. A long twilight, full of half-light and failed memory. On the 17th day of April in the year 1748, Muhammad Shah died. There was no grand mourning. The court wore white. Eulogies were written. Prayers were held. But it was a muted farewell. The empire had grown too used to disappointment to weep with sincerity. His body was laid to rest in a tomb that had been commissioned long before his death, back when he still believed in legacy. But the inscription was modest. The dome was small. Within a generation, his grave would be neglected, the marble dulled by rain and soot. And no one would mention the gold. After his death, they tried to rewrite him. The official histories compiled under his successors softened the edges. They emphasized his poetic spirit, his patronage of the arts, the tranquility of his long reign. His love of music was framed as sophistication. His withdrawal from war was recast as peacefulness. His poisoning, never named as such, was attributed to a consumption of remedies too refined for the common constitution. But the truth lingered in quieter places. Among the palace servants, stories passed in whispers, of golden powders hidden in rosewood boxes, of the emperor collapsing mid-verse, of the attendants forced to lift his decaying body for ritual ablutions. Among court physicians, there were warnings not to repeat Hakim J's methods, and among rival noble houses, there was barely concealed contempt for the man who had handed Delhi to an invader and then tried to erase his shame with alchemy. Within the Red Fort, no one spoke his name for months. Ministers avoided the topic. The harem fell silent. Those who had once flattered him began flattering others. Power, after all, does not pause for mourning. A new emperor had already taken the throne. Ahmad Shah, young and uncertain, chosen not for brilliance but for convenience. And yet, something had shifted. The illusion of permanence had been shattered. With Muhammad Shah's death, the fragile scaffolding of imperial authority began to visibly crack. Subas, provincial governors, stopped sending regular tribute. Military units began swearing loyalty to local commanders rather than to the peacock throne. The British East India Company, long dismissed as a minor trading operation, began negotiating not with Delhi, but with Bengal and Hyderabad directly. His death had not created the empire's decline, but it had made it unmistakable. The peacock throne itself, once the jewel of the Mughal court, had never returned after Nadir Shah took it. In its place sat a poor imitation, hollow, overpolished, too light to carry the weight of empire, much like the men who now claimed to rule. Even in death, Muhammad Shah continued to haunt the margins of memory. Poets wrote verses that alluded to a golden sickness. Alchemists became figures of suspicion, and among the empire's subjects, especially in the north, a folk saying began to spread. "He who drinks the sun will burn before he shines." That, perhaps, was the most honest eulogy, not in the official court histories, but in the caution whispered between generations. A lesson wrapped in metaphor. A man who mistook beauty for immortality. A court that let him. An empire that died in velvet silence rather than on the battlefield. Muhammad Shah Rangila is rarely remembered outside the footnotes. He ruled longer than most Mughal emperors, nearly 3 decades, but left behind no military victories, no architectural marvels, no sweeping reforms. His era, according to many historians, was the prelude to disintegration, a drawn-out coda after the crescendo of Akbar, Jahangir, and Aurangzeb. But to reduce him to that, a symbol of decay, is to miss the deeper tragedy. He was not just a failed ruler. He was a man born into a collapsing world who tried, in his own strange way, to delay the inevitable. Through beauty, through ritual, through gold. And perhaps that's why he drank it. Not because he believed it would make him immortal, but because he could not bear to be ordinary. Not after the shame of Delhi. Not after Nadir Shah had stared him down and taken everything. Not after the world, which once bowed at the Mughal name, now laughed behind closed doors. To consume gold was not just alchemy. It was performance, a final act of imperial theater. If his body could no longer command armies or birth heirs or inspire poets, then at least it could still be the site of spectacle, a living reliquary, a slow, glittering martyrdom. Today, his tomb lies in Delhi's Mehrauli district, overgrown and half-forgotten. The marble is cracked. The inscriptions have faded. Crows perch on its dome, and the scent of wild grass replaces the perfumes once carried by courtiers. Tourists rarely visit. No songs are sung for him in schoolbooks. His poetry is lost. But somewhere in the dust of history, his story endures, not as a warning, but as a mirror. Because all empires rot from within long before they fall from without. And sometimes the rot looks like beauty, like music, like courtly gentleness. Sometimes the end comes not with an assassin's blade, but with a whisper in a cup. This will preserve you. 3 antagonists walked through his life: a conquering general, a false healer, and the slow erosion of time. But perhaps the final antagonist was us, the generations who would rather forget quiet ruin than confront it, who prefer stories of decisive violence to the slow death of dignity. But his story deserves to be remembered, because in the end, There was no army, no rebellion, no divine punishment. There was only a man alone in a palace, burning from within, sipping liquid gold in the hope that he might hold on to his place in the world for just a moment longer. He failed. And yet, through this failure, he revealed something terrifyingly human. The hunger to be remembered, the fear of vanishing, the delusion that something beautiful might save us, even if it kills us. But history, like the rivers that once fed the Mughal gardens, does not stop flowing, and sometimes it bends. In recent years, a handful of scholars, quiet voices in dusty archives, have begun to reassess Muhammad Shah's reign, not as a mere prelude to disaster, but as the final chapter of an empire trying to feel alive before extinction. A flicker, however misguided, of beauty against the encroaching dark. They point to his restoration of Hindustani classical music, his subtle support of syncretic traditions in a time of growing religious rigidity, his deep, perhaps too deep, investment in the soul of the court. They argue that in a world tilting toward brutality, his aestheticism was not cowardice, but resistance. Not effective, not why, but human. Tragic not because it failed, but because it might have been beautiful if the world around him had not already decided to burn. Even the madness of gold is being reconsidered, not as delusion alone, but as a metaphor. An emperor turning his body into a reliquary. A broken man performing eternity. In some way, the final act of drinking gold was also a message to posterity. You may forget my victories, but you will remember my end. And we have. His death, like the empire he ruled, was not a clean break, but a long unraveling. The Mughal dynasty would linger for another century, reduced to a shadow play in Delhi's alleys, until the British made it official in 1857. But the real death blow had already fallen, not from outside, but from within. And Muhammad Shah Rangila, for all his failures, embodied that internal erosion with devastating clarity. He did not die a martyr. He died a mirror. And if we still speak his name today, in essays and whispers and videos like this, it is because his fall was not merely a cautionary tale. It was a confession, a soft, terrible recognition that sometimes we are not ruined by enemies, but by our need to be adored. That we do not collapse from violence, but from the silent, gilded choices that eat us from the inside. So let his story remain, not as warning, not as judgment, but as witness. Thank you for staying with this story. If it moved you, share it so that these quieter corners of history are not erased. And let me know where you are listening from. Somewhere, centuries later, we're still connected, still trying to understand how empires die and what they leave behind.